The desert heat shimmered like a veil of glass when Jonathan Hale first saw her. A lone figure emerged from the horizon, her steps slow but steady, as though every mile of the New Mexico wilderness had carved itself into her bones. Jonathan leaned against the weathered porch rail, his hand resting near the rifle propped by the doorframe. Strangers rarely brought good news out here. He squinted, the late afternoon sun a merciless hammer against his eyes. The woman was wrapped in a trail-worn cotton shirt and buckskin trousers, both stained by dust and sweat. A thin strip of leather bound her long black hair, though strands had broken loose and clung to her face. What struck him most wasn't her exhaustion, but her posture, straight-backed, unyielding, as if defying the land itself to break her. Jonathan shifted his weight, feeling the stiffness in his knees, the quiet ache that never left his back. He had learned long ago that the West respected only the unrelenting. It had taken his wife, Mary, and their newborn son 2 winters ago, and since then, his ranch was more tomb than home. A whisper of wind swept through, carrying the sharp scent of sun-baked earth and the low rustle of dry grass. The woman kept walking, unflinching under his gaze, until she stopped 10 paces from the porch. Her dark eyes locked on his, steady and unreadable. Something in them made Jonathan's throat tighten. He had seen that look before, in soldiers who had survived battles they never spoke of. "This is private land," Jonathan said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "I need work," she replied, the words as dry as the desert wind. There was no pleading in her tone, only quiet certainty, as if she'd already weighed every other choice and found them wanting. Jonathan studied her hands, calloused, scarred, the hands of someone who had fought and bled for survival. "Got a name?" he asked. "Ilara," she said. Just that, no last name, no explanation. He glanced toward the empty corral. "Lost 3 men last month. Gold fever took 'em to California, chasing dreams that'll turn to dust." He paused. Something in her stillness unsettled him. He knew he should send her away. A lone Apache woman on a white man's ranch was bound to raise questions he didn't need. But good help was hard to come by, and there was something in her steady gaze that spoke of unspoken battles. "You have experience with animals?" he asked, more out of duty than hope. Her lips curved, not quite a smile. "Only the wild ones." The hung between them like a shadow. Jonathan pretended not to understand, but a flicker of something, half recognition, half unease, stirred in him. He cleared his throat. "Bunkhouse is out back. Meals and $5 a month. First sign of trouble, you're gone." She nodded once. No gratitude, no relief, just acceptance. Jonathan watched her as she walked toward the bunkhouse. Each step carried the quiet grace of someone who'd learned to survive in silence. He told himself he had made a practical decision, nothing more. She would work the ranch, earn her pay, and move on. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was the first lie he'd told himself in a long while. As the sun dipped low, casting copper and gold across the mesas, Jonathan lingered on the porch. Ilara's presence felt like a crack in the walls he'd built around himself, walls meant to keep out both pain and hope. He didn't know why she'd come, or what past she carried like a shadow behind her, but something deep inside whispered that her arrival wasn't chance. It was the beginning of something neither of them was ready for. Jonathan found her in the barn at dawn the next morning, moving among the horses with a confidence that made him pause in the doorway. The stallion Shadow, a restless black beast that had thrown every ranch hand who dared climb on his back, stood quiet under her gaze. She didn't try to touch him. She just stood there, speaking low in a language Jonathan didn't know, her voice soft but unyielding, like water wearing down stone. "Careful with that one," Jonathan said, stepping inside. "He's thrown better riders than me." Ilara turned her head, meeting his eyes. Then they asked him wrong. Jonathan blinked at her reply. It wasn't arrogance, just a simple statement of fact, and something about it made him want to test the truth in her words. For the rest of the morning he watched her work. She didn't waste movement. She checked the horses' hooves, brushed out their coats, and spoke to them as though they were old friends. When she led Shadow out of his stall, Jonathan's pulse kicked. But she didn't push him. She walked in slow circles, letting the stallion circle her in return, their breathing syncing like some silent conversation. By noon, Shadow was following her as if tethered by invisible thread. At the main house, Jonathan poured them both coffee. Ilara sat at the table, shoulders straight, her face unreadable as the steam curled between them. "So," he said, "where'd you learn that with horses?" "My father was a horse talker," she said after a moment. Her tone made it sound less like a skill and more like an inheritance. She offered nothing else, no name, no story. Jonathan studied her scar, a thin white line running from her cheekbone to her jaw. It wasn't fresh, but it looked like the kind of mark that came from violence, not accident. He wanted to ask, but something in her silence stopped him. Later that evening, as the sky turned rose and gold, Jonathan found himself standing on the porch again, watching her haul water from the well. She worked with quiet determination, as if the weight of the world rode on every bucket she carried. He told himself he shouldn't notice things, the way her dark hair caught the light, the way her gaze never wandered when she looked at him. She wasn't here for him. She was here because she had nowhere else to go, and for all he knew, trouble was following close behind. After supper, they sat in the lamplight, sorting tack that needed repair. "You came a long way to get here," Jonathan said finally. It wasn't a question, but the words hung in the air, waiting. Ilara didn't look up. "Far enough." He tried again. "Any family?" Her hands stilled for a heartbeat on the leather strap she was mending. Not anymore. There was nothing cold or bitter in her tone, only the quiet finality of someone who had buried more than one chapter of their life. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing the calluses on his palms. He wasn't a man who asks questions easily, but the mystery around Ilara settled in his mind like dust, impossible to shake off. She was too self-contained, too careful with her words. And yet there was a strength in her that reminded him of the desert mesas, carved by storms, enduring despite them. That night, when the moon rose over the ranch, Jonathan stood by the barn, staring into the silver-lit yard. He saw Ilara near the corral, whispering to Shadow again. The stallion lowered his head as if bowing to her. Jonathan felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Not trust, not yet, but a sense that this woman, scarred and silent as she was, carried stories that could change the course of his quiet, crumbling life. He didn't know why, but a thought came unbidden. She's not here by chance. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. Shadow was the kind of horse that could break a man's ribs with a single kick. Jonathan had stopped counting how many wranglers had tried to tame the black stallion, only to limp off with bruises or worse. That morning, as the desert sun began to burn away the cool night air, Jonathan stood outside the corral and watched in silence. Ilara moved slowly, deliberately, as though the dust beneath her boots was sacred ground. She carried no rope, no bridle, just a handful of dried herbs tied together with rawhide. Shadow's dark eyes followed her every step, ears flicking back, muscles taut like coiled wire. Jonathan leaned on the fence, one hand resting on the worn wood. He'd seen men try to dominate that horse with sheer force, and every one of them had failed. But Alara wasn't trying to dominate. She stood a few feet away, whispering words in a language Jonathan couldn't understand. Her voice was low, steady, like a stream of water cutting through stone. Shadow pawed the ground once, twice. Jonathan's hand tightened on the fence rail. Then, without warning, the stallion lowered his head and exhaled a long, shuddering breath. It was the first time Jonathan had seen him surrender. "Careful," Jonathan called out. His tone was more warning than command. "He's mean as the devil when he feels cornered." Alara turned her head slightly, her face calm but unreadable. "Then I won't corner him," she said simply. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He didn't know if her answer was boldness or truth, but something about the quiet certainty in her voice made him lean in, watching more closely. For nearly an hour, Alara stayed inside that corral, moving in slow arcs, never rushing the horse. She offered her hand, palm open, and waited. Shadow stepped forward once, then snorted and pulled back. She didn't force it. Instead, she sat on the ground, cross-legged, murmuring in that same melodic tone. Jonathan caught himself holding his breath. By the time the sun climbed higher, Shadow was standing close enough to eat from her hand. She stroked his neck once, quick and light, before stepping back as if to tell him she wasn't there to claim him. When she finally left the corral, Jonathan met her at the gate. "I've seen cowboys spend weeks with that beast and get nowhere," he said, pushing the gate open for her. "What'd you do different?" Alara brushed dust from her trousers, her face half-shadowed by the brim of her hat. "I listened," she said. "He tells you what he needs if you pay attention." Jonathan frowned, intrigued despite himself. He had worked with horses his whole life, but he'd never thought of them as something you listened to. Later that morning, Jonathan found her by the stable, grinding dried herbs between two stones. "What's that for?" he asked. "For Shadow's temper," she said, holding up a faintly fragrant powder. "These plants calm the spirit. My people use them for animals and for men." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "You saying I need some?" Alara's lips curved, not quite a smile, but something close. "Maybe," she said. That night, while the ranch hands played cards inside the bunkhouse, Jonathan sat alone on the porch, thinking about what he'd seen. The image of Shadow's black mane against Alara's stillness lingered in his mind. There was a strength in her, quiet, patient, unbreakable. He found himself wondering what had carved that strength into her. Whatever it was, he knew it hadn't come without pain. The following morning, Jonathan woke before dawn, the desert air still cool enough to raise goose flesh on his arms. He stepped onto the porch with a tin mug of coffee, expecting only silence and the hum of crickets. Instead, he saw a lone figure standing beyond the corral, her silhouette etched against the pale horizon. Alara stood facing east, motionless as a carved stone figure. The first light of day bled across the sky, painting her in soft shades of gold and rose. Jonathan leaned on the porch post, not wanting to interrupt whatever she was doing. She wasn't praying like the preachers he'd known, with words and gestures meant to be heard by others. Her prayer was quiet, inward, lips moving faintly, hands pressed lightly against her chest. For a brief moment, Jonathan felt as though he were witnessing something private and sacred, a conversation between her and a God he'd never met. It stirred a memory. Mary, his late wife, kneeling at the side of their bed, whispering prayers when she thought he was asleep. He used to tease her gently, but now, watching Alara, he felt that old ache of loss. When she finally lowered her head, Jonathan cleared his throat. "Morning," he called softly. Alara turned, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Morning," she replied, voice calm and even. Later that day, Jonathan found her behind the barn, crouched over a patch of wild plants. She held a small knife and a leather pouch, her hands moving with practiced ease. "You're picking weeds?" he asked. "They're not weeds," she said without looking up. "This one is for cuts. This one helps fever. And this," she held up a sprig of narrow green leaves, "is for calming fear." Jonathan raised a brow. "Fear? You planning to brew me tea?" She glanced at him, a glimmer of something. Humor, maybe, crossing her face. "Maybe." He squatted next to her, studying the plants. "I've worked this land 20 years and never saw anything but grass and thorns." "You didn't look," she said simply. "The desert gives what you need if you know how to ask." Her words stayed with him, even as he saddled the horses that afternoon. Over the next few days, Jonathan found himself watching her more than he liked to admit. She worked without complaint, hauling water, mending fences, tending the animals. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her words carried weight. One evening, they ate supper on the porch steps, a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The sky was a deep indigo, stars pricking through like silver nails. "You always face east in the mornings," Jonathan said. Ilara hesitated, spoon halfway to her mouth. "East is where the sun rises," she said finally, "where life begins again. My people believe it is where hope lives." Jonathan looked at her, the lamplight flickering across her scar. "Mary used to say the same thing," he murmured without thinking. Ilara didn't ask who Mary was. She just nodded, as though she understood the weight of the name. There was a quiet moment after supper when their hands brushed as they cleared the dishes. Neither spoke of it, but Jonathan felt the spark travel up his arm like a memory of something long lost. He wasn't sure if it frightened him or gave him a reason to breathe deeper than he had in years. 3 days later, the wind carried more than just dust. It brought a rider. Jonathan heard the distant thunder of hooves long before he saw the cowboy crest the ridge. By the time the man pulled up near the corral, Jonathan was already waiting, one hand resting casually on his hip. "Afternoon," the cowboy said, tipping his hat. His horse was lathered with sweat, as if he'd been riding hard. "You heard the news?" Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "What news?" "About the Apache woman." The cowboy leaned forward in the saddle, voice dropping like a secret. "Marshal Boone's hunting her. Says she killed a cavalry soldier down south, cut him wide open. There's posters going up in every town from here to Tucson." Jonathan's gaze flicked toward the barn, where Ilara was brushing down shadow. Her back was to him, dark hair tied loosely, the late sun glowing off the copper in her skin. "You see anyone suspicious pass this way?" the cowboy asked, scanning the yard. Jonathan shook his head, his expression flat. "Just my hands, and they're all accounted for." The cowboy studied him for a moment, as though weighing his words. Then he spat into the dust. "Be careful, Hale. They say she's dangerous, knows how to handle a knife. If you see her, best ride straight to Boone." With that, the man turned his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust twisting in the air. Jonathan didn't move for a long while. The words hung heavy, heavier than he expected. When he finally turned, he saw Ilara watching him from the barn doorway. "Who was that?" she asked. "Just a drifter," he said, too quickly. He forced a shrug. "Looking for trouble, like they all are." Ilara's eyes searched his face, as if she could sense the shift in him. But she didn't ask more. She simply returned to brush and shadow, her strokes even and methodical. Jonathan stayed on the porch, arms crossed, but his mind wouldn't quiet. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the Bible Mary had left him, open but unread on his lap. His thoughts kept circling back to Ilara, the scar on her cheek, the way she always kept a knife within reach, the moments of silence that felt like they were hiding something deeper. He remembered the cowboy's words, "knows how to handle a knife." Jonathan rose and walked outside. The ranch was cloaked in silver moonlight, the air cool and still. He found himself drawn toward the bunkhouse where Alara stayed. Through the window, he saw her sitting cross-legged on the floor. A knife gleamed in her hands as she ran a whetstone over the blade. Her lips moved silently, forming words he couldn't hear. A prayer, perhaps, or something darker. Jonathan's hand tightened on the windowsill. When she looked up, their eyes met through the glass. There was no startle, no fear in her gaze, only calm awareness, like she'd known he was standing there all along. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet night. "Something like that," Jonathan said, stepping back. "Long day." She nodded once, then went back to her work, the slow rhythm of the stone against the blade carrying through the silence. Jonathan turned away, unsettled, but not sure why. Something inside him whispered that the cowboy's warning wasn't just idle talk. But another part of him, the part that had seen the quiet grace in her eyes, wanted to believe she was more than the shadows chasing her. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment, the sky was wide and endless, a sheet of pale blue. The next, black clouds were boiling up from the horizon, devouring the sunlight. Jonathan knew the signs, the smell of iron in the air, the way the horses shifted restlessly in their stalls. A summer storm on the desert plain could tear through the ranch like a wild beast. "Get the gates shut and the animals inside," he called out to Alara, already moving to secure the barn doors. She didn't argue. She ran for the far corral, her hair flying loose as the wind picked up. By the time the first drops of rain hit, cold and heavy, Jonathan was saddling his horse. He'd spotted a newborn calf out in the south pasture earlier that morning, a fragile thing barely able to stand. If it got caught in the flash floods that came with these storms, it wouldn't survive. "I'm coming with you," Alara said, her voice firm as she swung onto Shadow's back without waiting for permission. Jonathan opened his mouth to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't stubbornness, it was the same fierce determination he saw in himself whenever a life was at stake. The rain hit hard, stinging like needles as they rode out into the pasture. Thunder rumbled across the plains, deep and rolling, and lightning split the sky in jagged flashes. "There!" Alara shouted over the wind, pointing to a dip in the field. The calf was trapped in a muddy hollow, legs flailing as it tried and failed to climb out. Jonathan swung down from his horse, his boots sinking into the muck. "Hold Shadow," he ordered. Alara ignored him, leaping off her own horse to wade in beside him. Together, they pushed against the sucking mud, gripping the calf's slick body and hauling it free. It bawled weakly, splattering them with mud as it kicked. Jonathan wrapped an arm around the animal and lifted it to higher ground. By the time they reached the barn, they were drenched, their clothes plastered to their skin. Jonathan set the calf down in a dry stall, breathing hard. He glanced at Alara, strands of wet hair clinging to her face, her eyes bright with triumph. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm roared outside, pounding the roof with relentless fury. But inside the barn, it was only the sound of their breathing and the heartbeat that Jonathan felt thudding in his chest. "Good work," he said finally, his voice rough. Alara gave a short nod, water dripping from her eyelashes. "We did it together." Jonathan found himself staring at her, not just at the curve of her jaw or the scar that traced her cheek, but at the fire behind her eyes, the same fire that had carried her through whatever dark road had brought her here. As they sat on overturned crates, waiting for the storm to ease, Jonathan broke the silence. "You believe God listens?" he asked suddenly. Alara looked at him, caught off guard. "Sometimes," she said after a pause, "sometimes I wonder if he's turned his face away from my people." Jonathan's gaze dropped to his hands, scarred from war and work. "Maybe," he said slowly. "He sent you here so neither of us would have to walk alone anymore." Ilara didn't answer, but her eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment Jonathan felt something shift between them, an unspoken understanding, a fragile thread of connection strong enough to hold through any storm. The storm passed, leaving the land washed clean, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. The next morning, Jonathan found Ilara sitting by the corral, her back to the rising sun, her knife in hand. She was carving something into a piece of wood, slow, deliberate cuts that looked less like work and more like meditation. He walked over, leaning on the fence rail. "What are you making?" Ilara glanced at him, then back at the carving. "A story," she said. "In my people's way, we carve memories so they won't be lost." Jonathan tilted his head. "What kind of memory?" She hesitated, her hands pausing mid-cut. Then she set the knife down, her dark eyes lifting to meet his. "The kind that won't let you sleep." Jonathan felt the weight in her words, like stones dropping into a well. "You mean the soldier," he said quietly, though she'd never spoken of it. For a long moment, Ilara didn't move. Then she took a breath, steady but slow, as if bracing herself against an invisible wind. "It was last spring," she began, her voice low. "They were forcing my people onto the reservation. A soldier, he dragged a girl from my tribe into the riverbank camp. She was no older than 14. Her jaw tightened, but her gaze did not waver. I followed him. I stopped him. I did what I had to do." Jonathan's hands curled into fists on the fence rail. He'd seen men like that soldier, both during the war and after. Men who thought a uniform gave them the right to break others. "The law won't care why I did it," Ilara said. "To them, I'm just another savage with blood on her hands." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a resigned clarity that cut deeper than anger. Jonathan stood silent for a while, his thoughts tangled. He'd spent years respecting law and order, believing in the thin line between right and wrong. But looking at Ilara, he saw something the law would never see. A woman who had fought for what was right, even if the world named it a crime. "You were protecting her," he said finally. Ilara's lips pressed into a thin line. "That doesn't matter now. Boone is coming. Men like him, they don't care about truth, only the bounty." Jonathan's jaw set. He had always lived by the rule of staying out of trouble, keeping his head down, and tending his land. But something inside him shifted, the same stubborn streak that had carried him through war and loss. That night, as the sun sank behind the mesas, Jonathan sat alone with Mary's Bible open on the table. His thumb traced the familiar words, "Defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed." He closed the book slowly and looked toward the barn where Ilara was bedding down the horses. There was no question anymore. Whatever trouble she brought, he would face it. Not just because she needed help, but because, for the first time in years, he felt alive, like he had a purpose that went beyond survival. When Ilara joined him for supper, the silence between them felt different, less guarded, more like two people standing on the same side of a wall they'd both built. Jonathan broke the silence with a quiet truth. "Whatever happens, you're safe here." Ilara's eyes softened, but she didn't thank him. She just looked at him as if weighing whether he meant it. And Jonathan realized, for her, trust wasn't something given, it had to be earned. The news came 2 days later, carried by a trader passing through the valley. Jonathan was loading hay onto a wagon when he saw the man ride up, dust caked on his boots and jacket. "Marshal Boone's in town," the trader said, glancing toward Jonathan's ranch hands. "He's got a poster for an Apache woman, claims there's blood money on her head, says she's heading north, maybe this way." Jonathan kept his face neutral, but inside, something tightened like a noose. He nodded as if the information meant little. Appreciate the warning." The trader lingered a moment. "Boone's got a reputation, won't stop till he finds her. Be careful who you talk to." When the man left, Jonathan stood still for a long moment, the wagon rope slack in his hands. That evening, he rode into town under the pretense of buying supplies. He picked up flour, sugar, and a new set of clothes, a sturdy cotton dress, and a shawl the color of dusk. As he laid the items on the counter, the shopkeeper raised a brow. "Didn't know you had company on that ranch of yours," the man said with a grin. "Just thought I'd be ready for winter," Jonathan replied, his voice even. He didn't owe anyone an explanation, and he wasn't about to give one. On the way back, the sunset flared against the horizon, painting the desert in deep reds and purples. He rode in silence, the weight of his decision pressing on him. He'd made up his mind. Whatever Boone wanted, he wasn't going to hand Alara over. When he returned, Alara was tending to Shadow in the corral. She looked up as he approached, her gaze catching on the parcel in his hands. "What's that?" she asked. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Something for you." He set the package on the fence rail and unwrapped it. The shawl unfurled like a quiet promise, catching the last light of day. Ilara's eyes flicked from the shawl to his face. "Why?" "Because if Boone comes here, I want him to see a woman who belongs," Jonathan said, "not someone he can call a stranger or a fugitive." Her lips parted slightly, surprise softening the usual guardedness in her features. "You risk much for someone you barely know," she said quietly. Jonathan met her gaze, holding it. "Maybe I was just waiting for someone worth the risk." That night, the ranch felt sharper, the silence heavier, as if the land itself was bracing for what was coming. Jonathan checked the rifle by the door and the horse's tack twice before sitting on the porch steps. Ilarma joined him, pulling the new shawl around her shoulders. She didn't thank him, and he didn't expect her to. Gratitude wasn't the point. "Do you trust me?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. Ilara didn't answer right away. She looked out across the dark fields, the moonlight silvering her profile. "Trust isn't something I give easily," she said finally, "but you haven't given me reason not to." Jonathan nodded, feeling the unspoken truth settle between them. Boone might be on his way, and the world might see her as dangerous, but here, on this patch of land, she wasn't alone. Everyone's interaction means a lot to me. Please share your favorite number in the comments. The crunch of hooves on hard-packed dirt carried across the quiet ranch yard like a warning bell. Jonathan Hale looked up from the porch just as a rider appeared over the ridge, a plume of dust trailing behind. The sun was sinking low, painting the desert in burnt orange and shadow. Jonathan's hand brushed the rifle leaning against the doorframe, though he didn't lift it, yet. Marshall Boone was a big man, with the kind of face carved by years of pursuit and hard judgment. His hat was pulled low, but Jonathan caught the glint of a badge pinned to his vest. The marshal's horse snorted as he reined it in by the corral. "Hale," Boone called, voice rough as gravel. "Heard you been keeping busy out here." Jonathan forced a small smile. Ranch doesn't run itself. Boone swung down from the saddle with practiced ease and reached into his coat. What he pulled out wasn't a weapon, but a folded poster, its edges smudged and torn from travel. He handed it over without ceremony. The paper showed the sketched face of a woman, eyes fierce and unyielding. The name beneath read, "Ilara Blackbird, wanted for murder." Jonathan's stomach tightened, but his face stayed calm. He glanced at the paper, then back at Boone. "I can't say I've seen her." Boone's gaze was sharp, calculating. "Funny thing, folks say she's been spotted near here. Apache woman, mid-30s, scar on her right cheek. Ring any bells?" Jonathan shrugged, the picture held loosely in his hand. "We're 20 miles from the nearest town. Don't see many faces at all." Behind them, the barn door creaked faintly. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward it for half a heartbeat. Ilara was in there, he knew it. Probably crouched in the shadows, fingers wrapped tight around the handle of her knife. Boone didn't miss the glance. His lips curved, just barely. "Mind if I look around?" Jonathan stepped forward, blocking the path to the barn. "Afraid the horses don't take kindly to strangers." Boone tilted his head, studying him. "I'll keep my distance," he said, but his tone was laced with suspicion. Be a real shame if someone was harboring a murderer, could bring all kinds of trouble down on this ranch. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of every choice pressing on him. The line had been drawn. Jonathan kept his stance steady, shoulders squared, the wanted poster crumpling slightly in his hand. Boone's eyes, cold and sharp, flicked from Jonathan's face to the barn behind him, then back again. "You've always been a law-abiding man, Hale," Boone said, his voice deceptively calm. "Wouldn't want to think you'd risk that reputation over someone like her. Tell me straight, have you seen this woman?" Jonathan folded the poster slowly, tucking it into his back pocket as if it were of no importance. "I already told you, I've got a ranch to run. Haven't got time to keep track of strangers wandering the desert." Boone narrowed his gaze. "Strangers leave tracks, and I happen to be good at following them." He took a slow step forward, boots grinding into the dirt. "You got anyone staying here? Hands I don't know about?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "Just me and a couple of boys who help with the stock. No women folk here, except my wife." The words slipped out like a hammer blow. Boone froze, eyebrows lifting. "Your wife?" Jonathan nodded toward the main house, where Ilara's shawl was draped over the porch rail like it belonged there. "Married out of Bisbee last month. Pastor Wilkes officiated." He didn't blink, didn't let his voice shake. Boone's stare hardened. "Mind if I meet this wife of yours?" Jonathan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She's resting. Long day on the ranch." "You'll forgive me if I don't drag her out here for questions." Boone's suspicion deepened. He moved closer to the porch, glancing toward the door. "A man in my position has to be thorough. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind me having a look around." Jonathan stepped into Boone's path, his voice low but firm. "You're welcome to check the fence line, the water troughs, even the feed bins. But you won't be stepping foot in my house, not unless you've got a warrant." For a tense moment, neither man moved. The air between them seemed to crackle like the calm before lightning. Boone's hand hovered near his holster, not quite a threat, but close enough. Boone's eyes shifted toward the barn, the faintest glimmer of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Horses in there?" he asked casually, though Jonathan could hear the weight beneath the words. "Couple of them," Jonathan replied. "Nothing worth your time." Boone stepped past him anyway, boots crunching on the gravel path. Jonathan followed, every muscle tight. He could feel Ilara's presence inside that barn, could almost hear her breathing. Boone paused just outside the doors. His eyes narrowed at the sight of smaller footprints in the dust. "Don't look like just your boots around here," he said, his tone edged with accusation. Jonathan's jaw clenched. "One of my hands has smaller feet," he said evenly. "You want me to list their shoe sizes for you?" Boone ignored the jab, reaching for the barn door. Jonathan moved closer, his shadow falling across the marshal's hand. "You looking for horses or for a fight, Boone?" Jonathan asked, his voice low, his gaze steady. Before Boone could respond, a sudden clatter erupted inside. Shadow, spooked by the tension and the rise in voices, kicked against the stall wall with a sharp crack that echoed through the rafters. Boone stepped back instinctively, hand darting to his revolver.
What the hell was that? Jonathan seized the moment. "That shadow," he said quickly. "Wildest stallion I've got. Doesn't take kindly to strangers poking around." He pulled the barn door half open, just enough to show the silhouette of the agitated horse, stamping and tossing his mane. Boone squinted into the dim interior, but didn't step inside. Shadow's ears were pinned back, his powerful body shifting restlessly.
Jonathan gestured toward the stall. "You go in there, he'll put you through the wall. I'd rather not have to dig your boots out of the dirt after he's done." Boone hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. The marshal was stubborn, but even he knew better than to corner a wild horse without backup. "Your animals sure seem jumpy," Boone muttered, stepping back from the door. Jonathan gave a small shrug. "They don't like trouble." Boone's gaze lingered on the barn for another moment, suspicion still simmering in his eyes. But finally he turned away, his attention drifting back toward the porch. Boone lingered by his horse, his sharp eyes sweeping the yard one last time. The silence between him and Jonathan felt like a taut wire ready to snap. Finally, Boone slid the wanted poster back into his coat. "I don't like being lied to, Hale," he said, his tone calm but laced with warning. "If I find out you're hiding that woman, I'll come back with more than questions." Jonathan met his gaze without flinching. "I've got nothing to hide," he said. The words were steady, though his pulse thundered beneath them. Boone studied him for another heartbeat, then swung into the saddle. "Keep your eyes open," he called over his shoulder, as if the words were a threat as much as advice. "She's dangerous. If she shows up here, you'd bust do the right thing." Jonathan didn't answer. He stood motionless, watching as Boone's horse carried him down the dusty trail until he was nothing but a fading silhouette in the late afternoon light. Only then did Jonathan exhale, his hand brushing across his brow, slick with sweat he hadn't realized was there. The barn door creaked open, and Ilara stepped out, her knife still clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. "You lied for me," she said, her voice low and tight. Jonathan turned toward her. "I had to." She walked closer, the shawl he'd given her hanging loosely over her shoulders. "Do you know what it means if they catch you helping me? They'll call you a criminal too. You could lose everything." "I've already lost everything," Jonathan said, more harshly than he intended. He paused, his tone softening. "Except this land, and maybe my chance to do what's right." Ilara looked at him, the knife trembling slightly in her hand before she slid it back into its sheath. "Why?" she whispered. Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes steady on hers. "Because you don't deserve the rope they'd hang you with. And because—" He stopped himself, unsure how to finish. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, the tension between them as heavy as the desert air. Then Ilara turned away, her voice quieter now. "You don't owe me anything, Jonathan Hale. Don't forget that." That night, the ranch was quiet, except for the distant howl of coyotes. Jonathan sat on the porch, staring into the darkness with a half-empty coffee cup, when he heard soft footsteps behind him. Ilara stepped into the lamplight, her face unreadable, but her eyes shadowed with something heavy. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she stood by the railing, her fingers curling around the wood. "You want the truth?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan looked up, his gaze steady. "Only if you're ready to tell it." For a long moment she was silent, her eyes lost in the horizon where the desert stretched endlessly under the stars. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "It was near the San Pedro River," she said. "They were moving us, my people, like cattle, from one camp to another. There was a soldier." Her voice faltered, but she didn't look away. "He dragged a young girl away from the others. She was only a child, crying for her mother." Jonathan's chest tightened. He could already hear the rest of the story in the spaces between her words. "I followed him," Ilara continued, her tone sharpening like the edge of a blade. "I begged him to let her go. He laughed. So I took my father's knife and I stopped him. I didn't think, I just acted." Her hands clenched unconsciously, as if feeling the knife again. Jonathan didn't speak. He let her words settle, heavy as the night air. "The law won't care why I did it," she said finally, her voice trembling but strong. "To them, I'm just an Apache with blood on my hands. They'll never see the girl I saved, only the man I killed." Jonathan set his cup aside and stood. He crossed the porch until he was close enough to see the pain etched into her face. "Ilara," he said softly, "what you did was to protect someone who couldn't protect herself. That's not murder, that's justice." She shook her head. "Justice doesn't belong to us, not out here." He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. She didn't pull away. "Then let it belong to me. Your fight is mine now. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." For the first time, her dark eyes softened, the hard edges of mistrust fading. She didn't speak, but her silence said everything. Boone returned 3 days later. Jonathan had been expecting him, though the sight of the marshal's silhouette cutting across the pale horizon still sent a ripple of tension through his chest. The sun was barely climbing the sky, painting the mesas with streaks of fire, when Boone reined his horse to a stop in the yard. This time he wasn't alone. 2 deputies rode behind him, their rifles slung but visible. Boone dismounted slowly, his boots grinding against the gravel. "Mornin', Hale," he said, voice taut. "We need to have a talk." Jonathan stepped off the porch, his stance calm but unyielding. "About what?" Boone's gaze was ice. "About the woman you're hiding. I asked around Bisbee. No record of you marrying anyone. Care to explain that?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. He'd known Boone would check, and he'd known this moment would come. He glanced toward the house, where Ilara stood just inside the doorway, her hand hovering near the shawl he'd bought her. "She's not hiding," Jonathan said finally, his voice carrying across the yard. "And she's not some fugitive you can haul off like a piece of game. She's my wife. And if you or your men take 1 step closer, you'll be trespassing." The deputies shifted uneasily in their saddles. Boone's face darkened. "Don't test me, Hale. You know who she is. You know what she's done." Jonathan stepped forward, his voice steady and low. "I know she saved a life. I know she's stronger than any law that call her a criminal for it. And I know I won't let you lay a hand on her." For a long moment there was only the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees. Boone's hand hovered near his holster, and Jonathan felt the weight of his own revolver at his hip. Then, from behind Jonathan, Ilara spoke. "You want me, Marshal? I won't run. But know this, everything they say about me is only half the story." Boone's gaze shifted to her. Something in her stance, her unwavering calm, made him hesitate. He muttered a curse under his breath and looked back at Jonathan. "You're a fool, Hale. You'll regret this." Jonathan didn't move. "Maybe, but not today." Boone swung into the saddle, giving Jonathan a look of simmering anger. "I'll be watching." With a sharp tug of the reins, he and his men rode off, leaving dust swirling in their wake. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. Winter settled over the desert like a quiet blanket, softening the harsh edges of the land. Frost clung to the mesquite branches at dawn, and the air carried a sharpness that bit at the skin. Jonathan Hale woke each morning before the sun rose, the old habit of a soldier who trusted the early hours more than the crowded light of day. But now, when he stepped outside, the ranch felt different, less hollow, less burdened by silence. Ilara was there. She moved through the cold with quiet grace, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her dark hair glistening with traces of frost. While Jonathan worked on the fences or hauled water to the stock, Ilara tended to the horses, her breath forming pale clouds in the morning air. She spoke to Shadow in soft, lilting words, and even the wild stallion seemed calmer around her. When evening came, the two of them shared simple meals by the fire: cornbread, stew, and sometimes just beans with a pot of coffee. The crackling flames filled the spaces where words were scarce, and they found comfort in the quiet companionship of each other's presence. One night, as a bitter wind howled outside, Jonathan found Ilara sitting at the table with his late wife's Bible in her hands. She wasn't reading it in English, but murmuring the verses in Apache, her voice weaving a melody that seemed older than the desert itself. Jonathan paused in the doorway, the sight of her framed by the warm glow of the fire, stirring something deep in him. He sat down opposite her, listening as she finished the passage. "What did you just read?" he asked softly. Her lips curved in a faint smile. "Ruth's words. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people." Jonathan felt a lump form in his throat. He'd read that passage 100 times with Mary, but hearing it in Ilara's language gave it a new kind of weight, as if the promise was alive again, bridging two worlds that had always seemed divided. The weeks rolled on, winter hardening the ground, but not their hearts. In the barn, Jonathan watched Ilara move with quiet determination. She built a small corner with bundles of herbs and dried plants, explaining which ones could heal wounds or ease fever. "Your people know the land better than anyone," Jonathan said one evening, leaning on the stable door as she ground leaves with a stone pestle. Ilara looked up, her expression thoughtful. "The land takes care of us if we respect it. Your people—" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Sometimes they only see what they can take." Jonathan didn't argue. He had seen enough to know she was right. "Then maybe I can learn to see it your way," he said quietly. For the first time she smiled, not a fleeting curve of her lips, but a real, unguarded smile. As snow dusted the ground on the first morning of January, Jonathan and Ilara walked the property together, checking fence lines and feeding the animals. The sky was pale and wide, the air still and crisp. They stopped near the corral, where Shadow stood calm and proud, his black coat shining like polished coal. Jonathan glanced at Ilara, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her breath visible in the cold air. "Feels different out here now," he said. Ilara turned her gaze toward the horizon. "Because you're not alone anymore," she said simply. The words struck him like sunlight breaking through the clouds. For the first time in years, Jonathan believed she was right. By the time spring arrived, the desert had transformed. The cold winds of winter gave way to a warm breeze, carrying with it the scent of mesquite blossoms. Patches of green broke through the dry earth, and the creek behind the barn swelled with melted snow from the distant mountains. Jonathan stood on the porch one morning, a cup of coffee in hand, watching Ilara move among the horses. She was coaxing Shadow to the corral gate, her gentle voice carrying over the yard. The stallion, once wild and unapproachable, now followed her like a loyal shadow. "Never seen a man or woman tame a horse like that," Jonathan said as she approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She tilted her head with a faint smile. "I didn't tame him. I just let him be who he is." Jonathan chuckled softly. "Maybe that's what you've done to me." That evening they sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, while Alara sipped tea beside him. "I was thinking," Jonathan began slowly, "about bringing another hand onto the ranch, someone young who can learn the ropes." Ilara raised an eyebrow. "Or someone who needs a home?" He glanced at her, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "There's talk in town of an orphan boy. His parents were caught in a skirmish near the border. No family left." Ilara set her cup down gently. "You want to bring him here?" "I want to give him what I didn't have growing up," Jonathan said. "A place to belong, a chance to feel safe." He paused, his gaze softening as it met hers. "Maybe we could give him that together." For a long moment, Ilara didn't speak. Her eyes shimmered with something Jonathan couldn't quite read. Hesitation, hope, maybe both. "Children should know where they come from," she said at last.
"If we take him in, I'd want him to know both sides of his story, Apache and yours." Jonathan nodded, his chest tightening with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Then that's what we'll do." The sky grew darker, stars beginning to pierce the deepening blue. Ilara leaned against the porch railing, her shawl catching the last rays of sunlight. Jonathan watched her for a moment, his thoughts drifting to the day she first walked through the desert toward his ranch, dust on her boots, defiance in her eyes, and a strength that had stopped him in his tracks. "I used to think I was building a home out here," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "Turns out, home found me when you walked through that dust." Ilara turned to look at him, her expression softening. She didn't reply with words, she simply reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. As night settled, the two of them sat side by side, watching the stars bloom across the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's cry echoed, but the ranch felt safe, grounded and alive. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the stillness sink in. For years, he had lived in silence, a man defined by loss and solitude. But now, sitting next to Ilara, he felt something stronger than fear or regret. He felt peace. The world beyond their land would continue to change, and Boone might still be out there, watching. But here, under the wide western sky, Jonathan and Ilara had built something that no lawman could touch: faith, trust, and a future stitched together by love and resilience. If Jonathan and Ilara's journey stirred something deep within you, memories of courage, love, and the untamed spirit of the Old West, don't let the story end here. Subscribe to our True Wild West Stories series, where every tale carries a heartbeat of nostalgia, humanity, and timeless hope.